Please pray with me. May these words that I speak be grounded in my soul, encouraged by the God presence in me, and may these words you hear be captured by your soul and enlivened by the God presence in you. Amen. Is the microphone on? Is it okay? Are you hearing all right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so, suddenly, the church seasons change, and we are plunged into Lent. On first blush, it seems like leaving Epiphany behind is a move from light to darkness. But perhaps it can be couched in more friendly terms. Lent does come, after all, as a harbinger of spring, a promise of growth and new life. Perhaps a time to prepare for growth in us and in our faith. The church school curriculum calls Lent a time of preparation. When I read that, I thought, didn't we already do that in Advent just a month and a half ago or so? But perhaps these are quite different, these two times of preparation. There is a kind of hectic chaos to our Advent preparation. So much to do and so little time to do it in. That seems to fit the theme of Advent. Preparing for a child to be born is always a time for wild, chaotic anticipation. That preparation has a timeline and a deadline. In contrast, the preparation for Lent seems to be much more inward.
Sorry, Bob, I don't think you are on. Can you check it?
Okay. I'm not. Now I am. In contrast, the preparation for Lent seems to be much more inward, much more serene, less driven by time and deadline, even though there is a final goal. It needs to be much more patient. Perhaps in the gospel lesson which we just read, Jesus himself sets the tone for this Lenten preparation. At the introduction that Gary read this morning, following hard after his baptism by John in the River Jordan, comes the temptation of Jesus in the desert. Or perhaps the story begins much before that. There has always been speculation about the hidden years of Jesus' life. In Luke's Gospel, there is a story of his bar mitzvah at the temple in Jerusalem at age 12, when, according to Luke, he amazed the leaders with his wisdom and his understanding. And then there's nothing recorded until he shows up at the River Jordan at age 30 and is baptized by John. What happened during those 18 intervening years? There are lots of theories and speculation on what happened to Jesus during that time, based on, there are lots of theories and speculation based on his words and actions following the baptism. And I don't intend to go into any of that, except to say that whatever he did, during those 18 years, I suspect that Jesus was greatly troubled by the world that was around him. The terrible oppression of the Romans. The fact that they did not value human life and were so arbitrary or even sadistically violent in their treatment of his fellow countrymen. I suspect that Jesus was weighed down with anger and angst as he saw the hunger and starvation all around him, especially of the widows who had no family to support them and no means to feed themselves. I suspect Jesus was angered by the sickness and suffering that he witnessed, especially the suffering caused when those who were sick were also rejected and isolated by society. People like the lepers. How could God allow this to happen? Something had to change. Someone had to do something. Why do I think that Jesus wrestled with those kinds of questions during those silent years? I think so because the answers to those kinds of questions seem to have obsessed him in the desert. All the synoptic Gospels report that as Jesus was coming up out of the waters of his baptism, he heard a voice that said something like, "You are my beloved Son. In you I am well pleased." And suddenly, it wasn't who's going to do something. It wasn't someone ought to do something. It was, you are my beloved Son. You are going to be the one who answers this call. But as so often happens when we feel called like this, the call isn't the end result, or even necessarily the midpoint in discerning what we are going to do. It comes as more like a, so what now? What happens next? What does this call mean? What was Jesus being called to do? And so the scriptures say that he went into the desert to a very long time of discerning. The Gospels call this his time of temptation. They suggest that he considered all sorts of ways in which he might be able to answer the summons from God. If the call is wide open and the sky's the limit, then let's think in grandiose terms about what might happen. Perhaps he could start a rebellion. There was certainly a lot of unrest in Palestine. It wouldn't be difficult to start a revolt against Roman authority. It might even be successful. But Luke writes that Jesus considered that that avenue would simply be replacing one kind of power and control with another. People wouldn't be free. The authorities would change, but the lives of people wouldn't change. And we see that now in places where there has been revolts, Zimbabwe, South Africa, many places where one kind of power was replaced with another kind of power, and really for the people nothing much changed. Could do that, or maybe Jesus could see himself performing miracles like the feeding of the 5,000, which he did. And the people he gave food to would be fed, and they would bless him. But there was too much hunger that couldn't be solved by that kind of ministry. There were too many people who would still go hungry. That was not his call, though it was part of it. He could imagine performing miracles like healing, which would provide healing for the lives he touched. People like the lepers. And that was another part of his call. But those lepers who he did not touch, they would still be rejected and isolated, condemned to a miserable life and a lonely death. In the wilderness, as he dreamed of all the things that he might do in response to the need that touched his mind and soul, Jesus realized that he must do what other prophets had done before. He must speak about and bring into being a community which would reflect God's vision for the world. He must speak of the vision of God's kingdom, where in the words of the prophets Zechariah and Micah, at the end of the day, every man would sit under his fig tree and survey the work that he had done that day knowing that what he had accomplished would be for him and his family, and no man would be able to take that from him, and his family would be fed and safe, and no one would be afraid. To speak out and to live out that kind of vision was what Jesus dreamed about. He dreamed that was the call to say this once more as the prophets had said it. And perhaps this time those words would be heard and the world would be changed. And so he did speak those words. And the world did hear and lifted out, and the world was changed. Of course, much of this is speculation, reading into the brief Bible passage all sorts of other ideas. You'll realize why historic fiction is my favorite reading. Except that it does seem to fit with and pull together the parts of the story that are recorded in the gospel. And it fits our own experience. When I looked at the scriptures this week, I was surprised to see that in the desert, Jesus struggled with questions of how he was to act, what he was to speak. Just the things that we struggle with from time to time. Something has to happen. Someone has to do something. Is that someone me? Is that someone us? And if so, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to act? Out of those kinds of questions, there seldom come clear and concrete answers, at least not at the beginning. They're the kinds of questions that lend themselves to soul-searching over some period of time. And it was so for Jesus. The scripture says that he spent 40 days in the wilderness. 40 days is always biblical shorthand for saying a very long time. It kind of gives us permission, or perhaps even direction, to spend this time of Lenten preparation in patient and prayerful reflection about where I am going, or where we are going. You may feel that the content for this Lenten reflection is quite clear to you. Some of us may have been struggling with something that we need to ponder, and this is the time to ponder it. Or you may be wondering how to spend this 40 days of Lenten reflection, what to reflect on. I have a suggestion to make if the time of reflection isn't clear to you. Last Sunday, Jim Taylor was asking the questions of where we are right now in the light of Jim's stress leave, and without any answers. And there aren't any answers right now. They'll come sometime forward from here in discussions and reflections. But I think that we can reflect on questions about where we are right now as a community, all of us together, about how we as a community are moving into the future. The vision statement for Winfield United Church is, Winfield United Church seeks to create a safe, loving, and spirit-filled community where all can experience a growing awareness of the presence of God. How are we as a community doing that? Is this a safe and loving community for me? Are there people in our community who are not feeling safe and loved? What is a safe community? Is the creation of this kind of community really important in our day and age, in our city, in Winfield, in Lake Country? And if it is, how can we broadcast the presence of this kind of community in the broader community? Are we experiencing a growing awareness of the presence of God And if so, how are we sharing that experience in this church community and in the broader community? In his annual report, Jim threw out the challenge to us. He said, every church community, including ours, is at a difficult crossroads. The direction to be taken has two very different choices. To build a community for the present, or to build a community for the future. What are the differences between those kinds of communities? What kind of community do we envision for Winfield United Church? And what is the pathway forward that will enable that vision? Those seem like questions that are way too big to consider. But they are just the kind of questions that Jesus pondered in his wilderness sojourn. Making the decision about how we move forward is a decision that includes us all. Every one of our opinions and thoughts are important in that. And there will be opportunities for us to join in discussion about that. The annual general meeting is scheduled for March 11, in the middle of Lent. Soon after the Easter celebration, Council has planned a congregational retreat to talk about where we are as a community and where we are going. All this seems to me to be a call for each of us and all of us to spend Lent in the same way that Jesus did as he faced his life and ministry, in patient, prayerful consideration of the way forward for us all, as we understand it. I think if we spend Lent doing that, it will bring a richness to the discussions that lie ahead, that each of us will know that we have something to offer to those discussions. And those reflections may bring some clarity to the call of Winfield United Church. Let's begin that time of reflection now in just a few moments of quiet with our own thoughts and prayers.